We ended part one of this lecture with an extensive discussion of how World War II began to affect American society. Now I want to turn to military matters. U.S. troops didn't really get on the ground until late 1942, and they saw some of their first action in North Africa, where we see a combined operation between U.S. and British forces known as Operation Torch. Remember, though, that the United States and Great Britain are not the only Allied powers fighting in this conflict. Remember that the Soviet Union was drawn into direct confrontation when Hitler decided to launch Operation Barbarossa, which was an invasion of Soviet territory during the summer of 1941. His blitzkrieg strategy was very effective in the East as well, fighting against Soviet troops who were unprepared to begin with to fight against the Germans, who they thought mistakenly were their allies. Nevertheless, the Soviet Union began mobilizing for war and had spent a tremendous amount of time recapturing territory along the so-called Eastern Front in Europe. During this process, though, they suffered incredibly heavy losses of life. What we'll see is the Battle of Stalingrad is sometimes referred to as the bloodiest battle in human history, and there are no U.S. troops on this battleground. Instead, it will be a prolonged battle between August of 1942 and January of 1943 between Soviet troops and German troops. An estimated 1 to 2 million perished in this battle. Over time, though, Soviet forces prevailed against the Axis powers, which lost about a quarter of their total forces along the Eastern Front, just trying to maintain their position in the Soviet Union. This battle will eat up so many resources for Nazi Germany, a battle that they end up losing, that this will begin to have serious ramifications for the Eastern Front, meaning that the Soviet Union, with the Battle of Stalingrad, will manage to turn the tide of war in the East. Up until the Battle of Stalingrad, the Soviet Union had been losing territory to Nazi troops. Now, everything is kicking into reverse. Now the Soviet Union will begin advancing in Eastern Europe. And by 1944, as you can see from the map I have here on the slide, the Soviet Union will have not only regained the territory that had been invaded by German troops, but they will now be pushing through Poland. They're going to be pushing through Czechoslovakia. You're now going to have Red Army troops that are descending, really, upon Berlin, with the hope of eventually forcing the Germans to give up. In fact, some American military advisors started to get a little worried over the Soviet Union's success in Eastern Europe in countering the German menace. As the Soviet Union began making headway in the East, some American and British advisors feared that what we're going to see is that the Soviet Union would get to Berlin first and force a peace, and that perhaps the Soviet Union may not leave Eastern Europe after a peace settlement was brokered. I say all this because among Western Allied powers, specifically Great Britain and the United States, they wanted to open up another front in Europe. The Soviets controlled the Eastern Front by 1944. They needed a toehold in Western Europe for Western Allied troops, British troops, and American troops. This is the genesis for the D-Day invasion. Operation Overlord, or the D-Day invasion, as most of us know it by, was a plan among the Western Allied powers to establish a Western Front to counter Nazi aggression and also to counterbalance the advance of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. See, the mistrust between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union had not gone away, even though they're fighting technically on the same side during this conflict. At dawn on June 6, 1944, more than 4,000 Allied ships landed troops and supplies on Normandy's beaches. The first to land met with heavy, unremitting German fire. The casualty rate was sky high. But as waves of troops continued to come ashore over time, German forces were pushed back. In fact, within 3 weeks, over 1 million Allied soldiers had landed at Normandy, and the Second Front was now open. Let's be clear, though, the D-Day invasion was not just American troops. It was American troops at Utah and Omaha beaches. It was, however, British troops at Gold and Sword beaches, and also a Canadian contingent at Juno Beach. So understand that this is a multinational effort that ultimately succeeds in establishing a Western Front in Europe. Within 3 months, Allied troops were now entering the city of Paris, freeing it from Nazi domination. And they continued eastward, steadily making progress, eventually heading to Berlin. Unfortunately, even as Hitler's advisors began to realize and relay to him the information that they were likely to lose the war, we will see that Hitler's maniac obsession with, taking down supposedly inferior groups such as the Jews only accelerated towards the end of the war. The Holocaust will be a deliberate campaign on the part of Nazi Germany to exterminate the Jewish population in Europe. Between 5 to 6 million Jews out of a pre-war population of 10 million will be killed in these death camps. We must also make mention of other supposedly inferior groups in Hitler's eyes that were also targeted, rounded up in large numbers, and slaughtered. These included groups such as Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, gypsies or the Roma, anyone that suffered from mental instability or physical disabilities. And as I mentioned a moment ago, this horrifying campaign of genocide was actually accelerated towards the end of the war. In other words, Hitler at some point must have made the decision that, okay, I'm going to lose, but before I lose, I'm going to take out as many people as I can before that. By early 1945, it was becoming increasingly clear that in Europe, Nazi Germany was losing to the Allied powers. So we will see the leaders of the so-called Big Three, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, will discuss what to do next at the end of the war. President Roosevelt of the United States, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Joseph Stalin, the Soviet premier, will all agree to meet at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. Now remember I said that the Western powers, specifically the United States and Great Britain, were worried about Soviet aggression in Eastern Europe even after the war. Their biggest fear was that the Soviet Union, once it had its troops on the ground in places like Czechoslovakia or Poland, wouldn't want to leave those areas, that they would simply absorb them into the Soviet Union. So a very important promise was extracted from Joseph Stalin at the Yalta Conference. Joseph Stalin agreed to the notion that at the end of the war, he would allow free elections in Eastern Europe. He would allow the leaders of Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia to determine for themselves whether or not they wanted to join the communist empire or whether or not they wanted to have their own, their own type of government. He makes this promise. He will violate this promise. More on that to come. Adolf Hitler will commit suicide in May of 1945, and shortly thereafter, the German government will agree to terms of surrender. So in Europe, we will see World War II will come to an end by the spring of 1945. Remember, though, that we still have the Pacific Theater, that while Nazi Germany might have been defeated, that Japan is still fighting in the Pacific to maintain their holdings. Now, the United States, along with the British naval fleet, along with Australia's help, along with New Zealand's help, will manage to win several key battles against the Japanese, starting with the Battle of Coral Sea in May of 1942. However, what we'll see is that while the United States will begin to make headway, especially after the Battle of Midway, in retaking some of these islands in the Pacific from Japanese aggression, we're going to see that the land fighting gets nastier over time as the war progresses. Now, President Roosevelt had been presented with numerous plans to begin aerial bombardments of Japanese cities, and that is what took place. By 1945, a tremendous amount of tonnage had already been dropped on Japanese cities in their homeland. And in other words, you just see a massive carpet bombing campaign there, trying to weaken the will of the Japanese imperial government and the people, trying to get them to accept terms of surrender. But it's not happening. And then we're going to see President Roosevelt will die unexpectedly of a stroke while in Warm Springs, Georgia on April 12, 1945. The country, of course, is plunged into mourning, but now it falls to his former vice president, now President Harry Truman, to try to conclude the war in the Pacific against the Japanese. What we'll see is for now President Truman, he will have a new weapon at his disposal by the summer of 1945. The Manhattan Project, which had been laboring now for years to create an atomic weapon, had finally done so. So we will see for Truman, his military advisors believed that the United States should deploy this new weapon, which at the time they believed was just a bigger version of existing firebombs. Under their advice, we will see that President Truman will do just that. August 6, 1945, the city of Hiroshima will be targeted for atomic attack. The United States will wait several days for word on whether or not the Japanese government was willing finally to surrender. When they did not hear from the government, they will deploy a second atomic weapon over the city of Nagasaki on August 9th. The combined initial death toll from both of these bombings was more than 200,000 individuals. And of course, we will see in future years, as an understanding of what atomic weapons do to contaminate the soil, that there will be others that will pass away in future years at both of these sites from cancer, radiation poisoning, these sorts of things. After the second bombing, the Japanese government finally agreed to unconditional surrender on August 15, 1945. The atomic age is here to stay.